the shaded area of chart 2 that's just come up, we expect consumer price inflation to rise somewhat as the drag from lower energy bills wanes, that's the orange bars, and the contribution of services price inflation comes to dominate, that's the yellow bars. It's encouraging that we can now move forward from a lower starting point. But services and price inflation remains elevated, and recent downside news has tended to be driven by more volatile components, such as airfares and accommodation. We still need to see services price inflation come down more broadly to keep headline consumer price inflation at the 2% target. Monetary policy has been guided by the need to squeeze remaining inflationary pressures out of the economy to achieve the 2% target sustainably. We have needed restrictive monetary policy to lean against domestic second-round effects from those global inflationary shocks. We now face the question of whether the remaining domestic inflationary pressure, for instance manifest in services price inflation and pay growth, will dissipate naturally now that the global shocks initially driving up inflation have unwound, or whether achieving this disinflation will require a period of economic slack in the UK economy. Alternatively, are we experiencing sustained changes in the structure of the economy with longer-lasting effects on inflationary pressures? These have become important cases in the MPC's deliberations. As policymakers, we can think that all three cases are of relevance, albeit to different degrees. Now, the forecast that we publish in the Monetary Policy Report today is based on the second case. In the projection, second-round effects on domestic prices and wages are expected to take somewhat longer to unwind than they did to emerge. But a margin of slack emerging over the forecast period is sufficient to ensure that consumer price inflation falls back to the 2% target in the medium term. And this is shown in chart 3. The blue line is the projection for consumer price inflation, conditional on the 15-day average of the market-implied path for interest rates to the 29th of October. That's our usual convention. Headline inflation increases to around 2.75% by the second half of next year before falling back to around the 2% target over the medium term. Alongside the forecast, the committee has also considered the two alternative cases for how the persistence of inflationary pressures may evolve. In these cases, inflationary pressures may prove to be either less persistent or more persistent than in the projection. And this is set out in more detail in a box in the report. I'm now going to add some reflections on the key judgments that we've made on the outlook for inflation. Our November projection is conditioned on government policies as announced in the autumn budget. Chart 4 shows public sector net borrowing and how it is projected to change relative to the previous March projection by the Office for Budget Responsibility. In the autumn budget, the path for public sector net borrowing is higher than it was in March, but the chart on the left also shows that the difference is more pronounced in the first than in the future years. Public sector net borrowing is still projected to fall significantly over the forecast period. We provisionally expect the measures announced in the budget to boost the level of GDP by around 0.75% at their peak in a year's time. This reflects the stronger and relatively front-loaded paths for government consumption and investment, more than offsetting the impact on growth of higher taxes. Overall, fiscal policy is still expected to tighten over the forecast. But all else equal, the changes announced in the budget are expected to reduce the margin of spare capacity in the economy over the forecast period. The marginal effects on our inflation projections from the autumn budget are shown in chart 5, which has just come up. Combined, measures push up on inflation by just under 0.5 percentage point at their peak. That's the white line. The extended freeze on fuel duty pushes down on inflation over the next fiscal year, that's the orange bars. But as it is assumed to rise thereafter in line with announced government policy, fuel duty then pushes up on inflation from the second quarter of 2026. Other measures directly push up on inflation over the first year, that's the purple bars. Now, there are different ways in which the increase in employer national insurance contributions could play out in the economy. It represents an increase in the cost of employment. there are at least 4 margins of adjustment. Firms could pass on higher costs to consumer prices, or firms could absorb the increase through lower margins or higher productivity. Firms could increase wages by less, or firms could respond by reducing employment. Now, let me be clear. Public policy measures of this kind serve other objectives, and it's not for us to opine one way or the other. What we must do is respond to any consequences for inflation in order to meet our 2% target over the medium term. Now, we will get information on how the consequences for inflation evolve over time. A gradual approach to removing monetary policy restraint will help us to observe how this plays out, along with other risks to the inflation outlook. Developments in the UK labour market continue to be very important for assessing developments in inflationary pressures. There are mixed signals from the data. Wage growth remains strong relative to our models, perhaps reflecting some continuing real wage catch-up in a still relatively tight labour market. As Chart 6 shows, annual growth in private sector regular pay, that's in blue on the left-hand side, has eased to 4.8% in the 3 months to August, down from a peak of just above 8% in mid-2023, and indeed in line with our expectations in August. A normalisation in inflation expectations and easing in labour market tightness have supported that moderation in pay growth. Consistent with the slowing in the official measure, a bank staff indicator model of underlying pay growth has also declined in recent quarters, pointing to underlying wage growth of around 4.8%. That's the orange line. Along with some, but not all, outside surveys and measures seen on the right, this points to a gradual but progressive move down in wage growth towards levels consistent with the 2% inflation target. The bank's agents also suggest that wage settlements could continue to come down, perhaps to around 2 to 4% next year, compared with 6 to 6.5% in 2023. And I would add that this is the story that I've heard consistently when I've joined them recently on visits to businesses in different parts of the country. But 2 further observations should give us cause to reflect. First, 1 year ahead expectations for wage growth of firms in the bank's decision-maker panel seem to have stabilised at a higher level of around 4% in recent months. Second, the evidence, such as it is, points to the quantity side of the labour market remaining relatively tight while showing some loosening. Both of these observations could point to lingering persistence in wage pressures beyond what we're assuming in the projection. So let me conclude. There's been continued progress in disinflation, particularly as previous external shocks have abated. So at this meeting, the committee voted to reduce bank rate to 4.75%. Based on the evolving evidence, a gradual approach to removing policy restraint remains appropriate. Monetary policy will need to continue to remain restrictive for sufficiently long until the risks to inflation returning sustainably to the 2% target in the medium term have dissipated further. The committee continues to monitor closely the risks of inflation persistence and will decide the appropriate degree of monetary policy restrictiveness at each meeting. And with that, Claire, Dave and I will be happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Right. We'll start today with Larry for his last press conference, and then we'll go to Faisal.
Thank you. Governor, is the message from this report that as a result of the budget, interest rates will stay higher for longer than they otherwise would have done?
Well, let me begin by echoing what Katie just said, if you don't mind, Larry, on a personal note. I know this is your last... I don't know how many of these you've done, but it must be a lot. Too many. No, that can't be true. There's no such thing as too many of these. But look, Larry, I think we all want to join for answer the question together. And A, thank you for all you've done for British economic journalism, and B, wish you all the best for the future. It's been a pleasure working with you. What? And you are, of course, the first person ever to get applause in this press conference, because we will never get it. So all the best. So on the question about the budget, look, we've set out the picture. I would say, look, we've cut interest rates today. So, I mean, that, of course, is actually obviously significant in the context of the news. You'll see that the view we've reached, so that's the first thing I'll say. Yes, there is some upward effect on inflation, but the path of inflation, as we've set out, we think, returns to the target by the horizon that we look at, and that is what has given us, in a sense, support for cutting rates today. But what I would say, and I'll just re-emphasise what I said earlier, is that there's obviously a lot that we will learn about the effects of the budget as they pass through. I think it's important that we have time to do that. We all have time to do that. And so that underlines, again, the message we've given today. We'll need to see how these effects pass through. You saw I laid out quite carefully the channels through which the impact, for instance, on employment costs can work. They are obviously quite different channels, actually. We can have combinations of those. We no doubt will have combinations of those channels. And we'll want to observe very closely how that works. Our agents are fully primed to go out and start asking about it, and we'll want to get that information. Do you want to?
Can I add one thing just on? I mean, the market curve always moves around, and as we flag in the minutes, I mean, in the run up to the budget, it was being pushed up by US data developments. That's quite common. There has been movement since the budget. But we're seeing, we're seeing quite a lot of movement in the curve at the moment, given the events that are taking place either domestically or globally.
So I could add a bit about the detail, if you like, on the impact of the budget as we have seen it. You can see in our projections we've been quite clear. So obviously, the front-loaded fiscal loosening that the budget represents means we've got higher inflation by 0.3 percentage points at the end of next year, 0.4 the year after, 0.3 the one after that. That's quite similar to what the OBR have. Actually, they've got a slightly different profile because we, have slightly different views on the multipliers. They're slightly more front-loaded. But you can see there the impact of the budget on inflation, and that is, of course, set in the much wider context of what we've seen on inflation in terms of actually the numbers coming down and coming down by more than we expected recently, but also on the inflationary pressures that we see, and those also coming down, which explains basically the decision today.
Can we go to Faisal? Yeah.
Faisal Islam, BBC News. Just to reiterate that point, should people at home, should households expect mortgage rates, for example, to be higher than they otherwise would be, even a bit, as a result of the budget? And are you happy that the market response post-budget has been orderly?
Well, I think on mortgage rates, we've actually, we've seen some reduction in mortgage rates since the August report. Obviously, we've cut rates today, so we'll see how that feeds through. But obviously, how it feeds through for most mortgages now is depends on how the curve moves, because most mortgages obviously are priced off the swap curve because they're mostly fixed rate mortgages. So I don't think that it's sensible to conclude that the path of interest rates will be particularly different in that respect. And of course, let's be very clear, we don't set out an expected path ourselves because that, we respond to the news as we see it and form our views as we see it. So I would emphasize the point I made, that the profile that we have of inflation starts lower, does go up, but let's be clear when we talk about going up. I mean, these are a different order of magnitude of numbers compared to what we've been talking about in press conferences here for for recent years, and it's an altogether better magnitude in that sense. But then the key point is that it comes back down to target, and we think sustainably within the forecast period. So that's
just to reinforce Andrew's point. I mean, the curve. What we've seen, the 2-year rate for a 75% LTV mortgage has come down by 78 basis points since May. So that's in chart 2.7 that shows you what's happened to all the savings and borrowing, all the key savings and borrowing products. And as Andrew was saying, that's been, the reference rate for that important mortgage is the OIS rate, which has also come down over that period. But
I mean, I think just on the second part of your question, Faisal, and just looking at market movements over the last week or two. I mean, to start with, I think if you go back to the beginning of last week, I think the market was positioned long at the sort of shorter end of the sterling curve, so it was positioned for lower interest rates. I think what you saw sort of in the latter part of last week was some adjustment. So there was some closing of those positions as the curve moved up. Not surprising, because those positions have stop loss orders on them typically, and those stop loss orders can be quite highly correlated. I think that process happened. So we've had that process. But then, of course, what happened was, and this was really from Friday afternoon onwards, that the dominating, if you like, event was the US election, not anything going on in this country. And the curve obviously has been, curves have been moving around quite a lot over recent days, but I mean, it's quite clear that, that's been the more dominant factor. And I think what we were picking up from market intelligence was that there was quite a reluctance in the market to take positions while the outcome of the US election wasn't known. So you did get, I think, these two things coinciding. I think there was some closing out of positions in sterling into a market which was increasingly, certainly from Friday afternoon onwards, not really wanting to take positions given the uncertainty of the outcome of the US election. So I think that's the context. But I think now, look, you look at the market today, it's a lot more. It's pretty settled today. So, yeah.
And throughout the period, because obviously you'd expect us to keep a very close eye on monitoring. We've been seeing orderly market conditions.
Yeah.
Great. Let's go to Helia and then Sam, please.
Helia Ebrahimi, Channel 4 News. Governor, what's your message to households today? You seem to be saying that you're cutting interest rates because inflation is coming down. In fact, it's coming down faster than you expected. But you're also in the book saying that inflation isn't returning to target now until the middle of 2027, compared to the middle of 2026, which you thought before the budget. On balance, has the budget made your job harder?
So the message let's take two parts to the message. The first part is, you said quite rightly, is, look, we've got good news. The disinflation process, as I showed in the first chart, it not only continues, but actually has been faster than we expected. And not just faster over the last year, faster since we were last here in August, and that's good. And it's encouraging. There is greater uncertainty out there. Now, I would point to two things. I mean, first of all, there is greater global uncertainty, without doubt. The second thing to say is that there are domestic uncertainties, and I pointed to two of them in my remarks. One was just to emphasize, we need to obviously see how the budget measures pass through in terms of their economic effects, and then I pointed again, as I have done in the past, obviously to the labour market and how the adjustment of the labour market continues, and those things obviously are related as well. So it's a point about uncertainty, and that's why, as you'll have observed, the word gradual once again appears in our language.
Thanks, Sam Fleming from the Financial Times. In Box D, you talk about unexplained strength in import prices in the report and its importance for inflation. In that light, could I ask you about the result of the US election and the potential for higher protectionism, trade barriers, tit for tat, retaliation around the world? How do you think about that?
Sure.
In terms of upside and downside risks, especially in light of
I'm sure Claire wants to come in, but let me make 2 points to start with. First of all, the point we were making on import prices is not at all about the US election. It's really based on an observation in the data that the relationship between world export prices and sterling and UK sterling import prices has not moved as we expected. In a sense, they've not really moved together. We've seen some divergence with stronger UK import prices than we would have expected based on world export prices. And frankly, we've adjusted our assumption to reflect the fact that we don't see any evidence of that really sort of coming to a conclusion. On the second point about the US election, can I just make this point? First of all, we always respond to announced policies, and that's true in the world, it's true in the UK, not to stories about what they might be. So we're not going to respond to anything. The second thing I'll make, just to be very clear on this, we work with all US administrations, more obviously on the financial stability side than the monetary policy side, because that's the nature of financial stability versus monetary policy. But we work with all administrations. We will look forward to working with the new US administration. We worked with the previous Trump administration. We work with the current administration, and that's our good job. I mean, that's what we do. We do it without any, if you like, sort of presumptions, and we will do that constructively.
Yeah. Not much to add on the import box and the global export price, except to sort of reiterate your point that what we've done here is made a sort of change in our judgments, reflecting what we're seeing in the data, particularly. And the effect is not sort of insignificant on inflation further out.
Can we go to Sue and then Joel, please?
Hi, Sue Chan from The Telegraph. Just following on from Sam's question, I wouldn't dare ask you a question about policy, but just about the structure of the UK economy. How exposed is the UK economy to a potential global trade war? And given the UK exports more services as opposed to goods to countries like the US, are we more immune?
Well, I mean, the UK is an open economy. That's one of the things we always say about the UK economy, and it's true. It's an open economy. Of course, many economies are open, so we're not unusual in that respect. So, look, I think we will have to watch this very, very close, as we will. We'll watch it very closely. As I said, I'm not going to make any presumptions about what will happen, because I don't think that's either A, consistent with our policy remit, or B, wise. Frankly, I think let's see what happens. And there will, I'm sure, be a very open dialogue between both our government and the US administration. And I say where appropriate, just to reiterate the point, we work very closely with US administrations because it's obviously the right thing to do. And we will no doubt over time be able to get a better sense of A, what the policies are, and then B, to answer your question, how they might affect the UK economy. And of course we'll do that. But I'm just not going to, I don't think it's useful or wise to enter into sort of speculation at the moment as what they might be, because we just don't know.
Joel Hills from ITV News. I have a couple of questions. We have had a significant rise in UK interest rate expectations in the last few weeks. How much of that do you assess is down to domestic UK factors, and how much of that is down to international factors, please? And you have just cut to 4.75%, a level you say is restrictive. You'll get a round of applause if you do answer this one. You are talking about gradually removing policy restraint. Yeah. At what level of interest rates would policy no longer be restrictive, please? Because you must have that in mind when you make those statements.
Well, that's, of course, the Ben Broadbent Memorial question. Yeah, but you're probably safe from getting the Ben Broadbent Memorial answer, where he'll talk about John Williams, the Welsh economist. We'll save you that one. Look, to start with the interest rate point. Look, let me give you one, I think, quite interesting fact. And actually, I'll go back to, we'll take it back to sort of a couple of days ago. If you look at movements along the interest rate curve from the beginning of October to a couple of days ago, and you compare the US curve with the UK curve, they basically moved by about the same amount.
Comments there from the Governor of the Bank of England, Andrew Bailey, following that announcement that the bank is going to has lowered interest rates to 4.75%. In response on the market, sterling rose 0.4% against the US dollar, 0.2% higher against the euro. Elsewhere, the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee said that the Chancellor's £70 billion package of tax and borrowing measures will deliver a 3/4 point increase to GDP next year. You're watching Sky News. Still to come throughout the course of this afternoon, we'll bring you all the latest from the United States. We're expecting Joe Biden to make an address from the White House to the nation at around 4 p.m. local time here in the UK. We'll bring you all of the developments as they happen. Plenty more insight, analysis and coverage on the Sky News website and the Sky News app. Stay with us, of course, for the full story first.
Hello, good afternoon. It's 1 o'clock. You're watching Sky News. These are the headlines. Interest rates decision down to 4.75%. The Chancellor says it's welcome news for millions of families.
The economy is growing, interest rates and inflation are coming down. That is a world away from the last Parliament.
Live in Philadelphia here in the United States. Later this afternoon, we'll hear from Joe Biden for the first time since Donald Trump's comeback election victory. Today, the president-elect starts to put together his top team as he's invited for transition talks at the White House. Kamala Harris bows out, telling supporters to accept the result, but never give up on the future fight. We'll bring you President Biden's address from the White House live here on Sky News at 4 o'clock this afternoon.
Also, this lunchtime, the suspended Labour MP Mike Amesbury is charged with common assault following an incident in Cheshire last month. And the UK announces new sanctions on Russia at a meeting of European leaders in Hungary, focusing on the future for Ukraine under President Trump. Hello, good afternoon. The Bank of England has cut its interest rate in what is only the second decrease in more than 4 years. It comes as inflation is at its lowest level in over 3 years. Although the bank did warn that the Chancellor's budget, delivered last week, will contribute to a rise in inflation. Well, now the rate stands at 4.75%. A short time ago, we heard from the Governor of the Bank of England, Andrew Bailey, who was asked how the Chancellor's first budget affected the rate decision.
Look, we've cut interest rates today, so I mean that, of course, is actually obviously significant in the context of the news. You'll see that the view we've reached. So that's the first thing I'll say. Yes, there is some upward effect on inflation, but the path of inflation, as we've set out, we think returns to the target by the horizon that we look at, and that is what has given us, in a sense, support for cutting rates today.
Well, let's bring in our business and economics correspondent, Gurpreet Narwan. So, Gurpreet, it was expected, good news for mortgage holders. How much bearing has the budget had on this, do you think?
Yeah, it was a widely expected move. The Bank of England shaving off 0.25 percentage point off the base rate, taking it to 4.75%. It marks just the second interest rate cut in 4 years. So good news for mortgage holders, as you pointed out, and further evidence that the bank is confident that we're really turning a corner on inflation. Now, Andrew Bailey in his press conference said that the disinflationary process has progressed well, and crucially, he said it was happening faster than expected. The Bank of England, the members of the Monetary Policy Committee, will have taken a number of factors into account beyond the headline rate of inflation, which fell below the 2% target in September to 1.7%. It would have also looked at services inflation as well as wage growth, although Andrew Bailey did say he was a little bit concerned that services price inflation wasn't falling as quickly as he'd like to. Good news for mortgage holders then, this will feed in to lower mortgage rates for the 1.5 million households or so who are on variable mortgages. For someone on with a mortgage of about £100,000, that will translate into a saving of £25 a month. And as you can imagine, it's good news for the government as well. Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, had some warm words to say about it. Let's have a listen to what she had to say.
Interest rates are now on a downward path, evidenced by the cut in the interest rates today by the Bank of England. And both the Office of Budget Responsibility and indeed the Bank of England forecast today shows that the economy is growing, interest rates and inflation are coming down. That is a world away from the last Parliament, which was the worst Parliament on record for living standards. Inflation reaching more than 11%, interest rates spiking after the mini-budget, and growth stagnant too.
But there were some aspects of the Bank of England's monetary policy report today that would have made Rachel Reeves a little bit nervous, because although the bank said it was confident that rates would come down gradually, it also pointed out that The Chancellor's budget is inflationary. It said that that big fiscal stimulus, the increase in government spending that the budget contained, would increase growth in the short term, but that it would also add half a percentage point to inflation in 2 years' time. So a clear warning sign that the path of interest rates might be slower to come down than initially expected.
Good afternoon, then live from Philadelphia in Pennsylvania, one of the key battleground states that helped Donald Trump win the presidency. We are here on those famous rocky steps. It was right here where Kamala Harris delivered her big finale amid hope and expectation, backed by a cast of A-list stars, Lady Gaga, Oprah Winfrey, Ricky Martin as well. Well, later on this afternoon, in a few hours' time, at 4 p.m. in the UK, we will hear from President Joe Biden for the first time since the election result was announced. He is speaking to the nation from the White House. We will bring that to you live here on Sky News. Well, last night, Kamala Harris promised a peaceful transfer of power as she addressed disappointed campaigners in Washington, as our US correspondent Martha Kellner now reports.
The stage had been set for a victory party, but sooner than anyone expected, Kamala Harris here to acknowledge a defeat so colossal there could be no question.
While I concede this election, I do not concede the fight that fueled this campaign.
Many in this crowd had been here the previous evening. They'd hoped to see America's first female president. Harris offered her supporters reassurance and urged resilience.
Do not despair. This is not a time to throw up our hands. This is a time to roll up our sleeves.
She'd earlier phoned President Trump to congratulate him. She promised the transfer of power would be peaceful this time round.
A fundamental principle of American democracy is that when we lose an election, we accept the results.
Kamala Harris struck an optimistic tone, but there's no escaping the completeness of this defeat. And now the soul-searching. Could they have done anything differently? And what next for her and the Democratic Party? Much of the ire is focused on President Biden. Did he cling to power too long, giving Harris too much to do in too short a time?
I genuinely do think so, because she had the shortest campaign in history. I think that he should have stepped down a little bit sooner and allowed her to really flourish and build her campaign a lot earlier.
Do you think she might have been too loyal to President Biden?
People are going to have critiques no matter what. Had she been more aligned, they would have critiqued. If she was completely on the other side of that, they would have critiqued. My gut says that racism and sexism, the rooting of fascism and authoritarianism in this country is very real.
What do you think went wrong?
Too much. Part of it is that our country is just not ready for a woman. Unfortunately, there's also this segment of America who just wants the old white guy.
Women who are part of the same sorority as Harris were grieving what could have been.
We had expectations that women would stand up for themselves and our reproductive rights, and they didn't do it. And I guess that's the end of the story.
I think it shows that we're in a very hateful state right now, and people just need to wake up and smell the roses.
This American dream is over for Kamala Harris. Another woman tried and failed, beaten by Donald Trump. Not just a rejection of her, but of the Democratic Party. And if they're to win back their base, major rebuilding and rebranding is needed. Martha Kellner, Sky News, Washington, D.C.
A little bit like Rocky, this is where everyone comes for their morning jog here in Philadelphia. So we've nabbed Jake, who's on his run now, just to ask you your reaction to what we saw. Obviously, Kamala Harris gave her, farewell speech, if you like, to people in Washington last night. It was here, exactly on these steps, that she seemed so hopeful on Monday evening in front of a huge and optimistic crowd. What went wrong for her, do you think?
Honestly, I think we were all very hopeful. I think
thinking back to 2020, thought, how could this happen again? But I think a lot of us are taking a deep look inside. Really, how did this come to be? And it came, we are a nation divided. You know, it's a tough hit for all of us, right? For all the women's rights, equal rights, immigration rights. And now we see what's happening. I can only hold my head up high, and as well as what Kamala said, and what we need to do as a nation, and continue forward and keep fighting.
Yes, I made a presumption that you were a Democrat. This is such a Democratic city, isn't it?
Yes, it
it's
is.
the rest of Pennsylvania which has really voted for Donald Trump, apart from Pittsburgh and these urban centres. I mean, lots of people talking about that the Democratic Party has lost its base. You know, that ethnic minorities, Latinos, black people, they have not voted in the same numbers as before.
I think also a lot of those undecideds didn't come out and vote. If you just look at the numbers, you know, what, close to 20 million were either undecided or didn't vote for Democratic Party. So what does that tell us about our two-party system, really? But, you know, in terms of getting behind one candidate over the other, you know, I don't think it was, oh, I like Donald Trump more than I like Kamala, or I agree with him. I just want to see a strong leader. And honestly, I think, you know, we needed to do a better job really forcing, you know, people to know, hey, this is what the future looks like under a Democratic president. This is what change we can do. This is how it's going to affect not just Democrats, Republicans, all the libertarians in the middle, because I think we've kind of morphed. In personal views, I'm, you know, always blue, and there's a little bit of other in there. So I think that's what we really need to focus on.
We'll see Joe Biden at the White House later on, addressing the nation for the first time since this loss. Is this down to him, or is it down to, in fact, that Kamala Harris was, you know, an incumbent effectively as vice president? Should Joe Biden ever have stood? Should he have realized that he was just too old for the job?
Well, I'm no political correspondent or a political background, but, you know, what it shows us is indecisiveness. And I think, you know, a lot of the base is how can we trust the party? And, you know, if we're not 100% behind our party, and, you know, I want to be behind the president. So what we're expecting now, I expect Joe Biden to stand up, fight the remaining months that he has left in office, keep us holding high, and not degrade ourselves and be worried and focused on all this negative energy, because we can't change that fact.
Well, there is some negative energy towards Donald Trump from, you know, a large proportion of the population of in this nation who did not vote for him. Do you have any specific concerns? Are you optimistic he can make some of those changes that he promised so vociferously?
I have many concerns, of course. I think naturally many folks do, but I think it's a lot of strong rhetoric, you know, and what are we actually going to see in terms of policy change? How is he going to affect the economy? How is he going to affect immigration? You know, if we look at what's going on with the Mexican border, everyone's rushing to the border because they're worried when Donald Trump comes into power again in January, it's going to close off the borders. So I would expect our current Democratic Party to stand up, relieve those fears, or do whatever they can to alleviate all of our concerns, and just know that we're going to be fine. But we still need to fight at the local level, at our regional local level, our state level, because at the end of the day, you know, a lot of what has been going on with abortion rights is down to the state. And that is a very telling sign. Whether it's Republican, Democrat, it's Kamala or Donald Trump, there's still many indecisiveness at the state level. Something as clear as abortion rights and a woman's right to choose, and just women's rights in general. And if we can't agree with that on a state level, how can we agree with that on a national level?
Well, keep up the fight is the message that Kamala Harris gave yesterday, isn't it? Connie, you have been very patient with us. We will let you continue your jog and your walk.
Thank you so much.
Well, runners one as well as this. Enjoy the rocky steps. Thank you very much indeed. Jake, there, yes, this is such a democratic city. It's, you know, it's hard in certain communities to find Republicans here. Well, before being elected, Donald Trump promised a radical and far-reaching policy programme. Some of the ideas that he could push are contained in a blueprint known as Project 2025, which is not official policy, but its authors are known to be close to the president. The project calls for the dismantling of key agencies like the Departments of Education, Homeland Security and the FBI. The document also sets out its opposition to what it calls the Great Awakening, calling for the restoration of the family as the centerpiece of American life. Proposals include the criminalization of pornography, tightening up access to abortion, and rolling back LGBTQ+ rights. And on immigration, Project 2025 calls for the largest effort to deport illegal immigrants in US history, something that Donald Trump promised to do during the campaign. But it's not clear how many of those ideas could become policy, but one thing is for sure. Not only has Donald Trump gained the White House, his party has taken much greater control over the wider US political power system. The Republicans have gained control of the Senate with at least 52 senators, and they could also win control of the House of Representatives, giving them a clean sweep of all government departments. They're currently only running slightly short of a majority in the House. Well, our US correspondent Mark Stone reports now on what it could all mean.
America has given us an unprecedented and powerful mandate.
A result which came in the dead of night, but a decision made eyes wide open.
We have taken back control of the Senate. Wow, that's good.
Because America knows Trump, it chose him again, and it awarded him, it seems, a clean sweep.
And it also looks like we'll be keeping control of the House of Representatives.
Dark storm or new dawn, we'll see. But one thing is clear, power was cemented overnight. So what will all this look like after the ride that was his first presidency, after all the warnings from the critics and all the rhetoric from the man himself?
You're not going to be a dictator, are you? I said, no, other than day one. I am your retribution. I am your retribution.
So how much of this is bombast? After all, his first term was hardly one of fulfilled promises. So will he break these or finish the job he started, this time unopposed?
We've already had Trump as president of the United States, and the Republic still stands. I mean, there's no difference in Donald Trump 1.0 versus this Donald Trump 2.0, except for the fact that Donald Trump 2.0 has a very keen understanding on how Washington works.
In the heart of the place he may now fully control, the old guard of a Republican Party reset, reflecting on the achievement.
Let me start by congratulating President Trump. What he's accomplished has not been done, as all of you know, since Grover Cleveland, which was a while back.
Landslides allow mandates to be delivered, and the clues for the road ahead may be here. Project 2025, written by the people who helped him to victory. Not all of this will be adopted, but plenty will be. Deportations, tariffs, more power to the presidency, wholesale reform of government.
Take over, Elijah, take over.
In the days ahead, the transition team will emerge, to include, maybe, those who he has already outlined his plans with.
And what I'm going to do, one of the first acts, and this is where I need an Elon Musk, I need somebody that has a lot of strength and courage and smarts. I want to close up Department of Education, move education back to the states.
I think you're making a good point.
Then there's Robert F. Kennedy Jr., anti-vaxxer, climate activist. What will his influence be?
You will not take any vaccine that is currently on the market.
If vaccines are working for somebody, I'm not going to take them away. People ought to have a choice, and that choice ought to be informed by the best information.
The victory was clean, decisive. Now comes the delivery. Mark Stone, Sky News in Washington.
We'll be back a little bit later for more from Philadelphia. Just a reminder, too, that coming up, Joe Biden will be giving that speech from the White House. That is on Sky News at 4 o'clock this afternoon. Plenty of reaction to that. For now, let's head back to Jane.
Very much, Anna. Let's just bring you a little bit of breaking news regarding the MP Mike Amesbury, who's been charged with assault after a video emerged of him apparently punching a man to the ground. Well, he has just released a statement. He says, "I have today been summoned to court to face a charge of common assault following an incident in Frodsham last month, which was, in his words, deeply regrettable. I am continuing to cooperate with police, and given this is an ongoing case, I cannot comment further." So that is a statement from the former Labour MP, Mike Amesbury, now an independent MP, on what has happened since he has been charged. You're watching Sky News Today. Coming up, Russia launches an 8-hour overnight drone attack on Ukraine ahead of President Putin giving a speech today on foreign policy. More of our coverage of Donald Trump's US election win. We'll be speaking to a former speech writer to George W. Bush. And a fresh appeal for information about an unsolved murder of a 13-year-old girl 30 years after she disappeared.
Big stories don't always come from big cities. I'm Lisa Dowd and I'm Sky's Midlands correspondent.
You are not getting in this elevator, okay?
The judge made it very clear that she could see no justifiable reason why Sakulas wasn't here facing British justice.
I promised I would get him justice.
Free, wherever you get your news. This is what they're up against. The wind is the really big problem. It is back-breaking work and the smoke is thick. It's been working well. Water levels are dropping, but no one knows what impact further rain will have. What would you do if this place wasn't open? This is the exact spot in Nottingham where their 19-year-old son, Barnaby Webber, lost his life.
I just think it's so cruel and so harsh.
It's really scary. We're terrified.
In this community, I'm told that everybody knows someone affected by COVID.
Hopefully this will be the last wave.
Sky News gets the full story first. Change seems tantalisingly close in this corner of the UK. Wales was the first to introduce the plastic bag charge. It's legal to let go. Set the speed and take the hands off. It's almost driverless, but not quite. Hans is a highly trained police dog. The force is incredible. It's really frightening, actually. This is my patch, my specialism. It's also my home.
The future for the war in Ukraine following Donald Trump's election is dominating attention at a summit of European leaders today in Hungary. The UK earlier announced 56 new sanctions against Russia, the largest package unveiled in 18 months. And later, President Putin's expected to deliver a major foreign policy speech this afternoon. Our political correspondent Tamara Cohen is in Budapest, where the meeting is taking place.
Well, this security summit has now turned into European leaders collectively discussing what they do regarding Donald Trump. How do they respond to his election win? It's really colouring everything else that is happening here, because whether it's the prospect of a trade war, and we've had European leaders here saying that Donald Trump must be dissuaded from that, whether it is defence and the prospect that he turns away from European defence and NATO towards the Pacific, and whether, of course, on the critical issue of Russia and Ukraine, he takes a different view to the current administration and is minded, as he talked about a few months ago, to try and fix that conflict in 24 hours. Is he going to try and push Ukraine into accepting a deal in which they would give up a lot of territory? These are the sort of questions that European leaders are discussing. Now, of course, the majority view in Europe, including of our own Prime Minister Keir Starmer, who is here today, is that Ukraine should be allowed to decide its own future. President Zelensky is here. He has congratulated Donald Trump and made clear he hopes that America will be a strong friend of his country. But the majority view in Europe is that they should carry on supporting Ukraine, and that means, frankly, European nations stepping up, spending more on their own defence and spending more to support Ukraine. I caught up earlier with the new Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, and he told me that Trump's election would force European countries to do that. This is what he told me.
I think what it will mean for all of us is that you have a president who is experienced, who is extremely clear about what he wants. He will push us all to spend more on defense, and he's right on this. He was right. He got his way. We went to the 2%, thanks to his doing for a large part. But he will also force us to do more in the future. And when you look now at North Korea getting involved in Ukraine, delivering the latest state-of-the-art missile technology from Russia. The fact that China, Iran, North Korea and Russia are working together. This is a threat not only to the European part of NATO, but also to the United States mainland, but also to our partners like Japan.
So his message is pretty stark, and the Prime Minister is yet to set out how the UK will get to his campaign promise to spend 2.5% of GDP on defence. So questions all round about how Europe steps up to this big challenge. Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary and ally and friend of Donald Trump, he's talked about champagne corks popping at the prospect of his re-election, is chairing this summit. But he is very much out on a limb there. The rest of Europe very much wanting to support Ukraine. We'll see how much how strong they are in their support in what they say later today.
With developments in Ukraine firmly in the spotlight, Russian strikes have hit several areas in the Ukrainian city of Kiev overnight. Officials say damage was caused to residential and factory buildings, but no injuries have been reported. The overnight barrage comes as the UK announces a further 56 sanctions against Russia, something that Moscow is yet to comment on. Later today, President Putin will give a foreign policy address in an annual speech, which he delayed until after the US election had been decided. He'll be talking near Sochi. Our Moscow correspondent, Ivor Bennett, is there.
It feels like it's no coincidence that he's chosen this week, in the days after the US election, to hold his annual Valdai Discussion Club here at this ski resort above Sochi. So he'll almost certainly address it. But I think the question right now is, what has he said so far in the last 24 hours? Initially, yesterday, the Kremlin said that Vladimir Putin had no plans to congratulate Donald Trump on his election win. But overnight, reports emerged that he had sent a message privately through mutual friends. But in the last couple of hours this morning, the Kremlin, according to Russian news agencies, has denied those reports. So it's all very confusing about what Vladimir Putin has said or not to Donald Trump. The official line certainly is that the US, according to Russia, is still a hostile state. Relations are at a historic low. Those are the words of Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin's chief spokesman, yesterday when he gave that initial reaction to the result. He downplayed the idea that Donald Trump could bring the war in Ukraine to a swift close, despite all the promises on the campaign trail. He said, "We will see." So on the face of things, they are adopting quite a guarded approach, quite cautious, apparently not expecting any sudden shift in foreign policy, despite all the words on the campaign trail. And I think there's a reason for that, and that is because the last Trump presidency didn't quite pan out how Russia had hoped. There were warm words from the start, but by the end of it, the US had imposed several rounds of sanctions on Russia, and that is something Moscow hasn't forgotten. And it was something, I think, referenced by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs here in their statement yesterday. They said Moscow has no illusions about Trump, so they know that he doesn't necessarily stick to his words. But I think given all the criticism on the campaign trail by the Trump team of US military aid to Ukraine, I think it's hard not to believe that he was the Kremlin's preferred candidate in this race, because if he does curtail the military support to Ukraine, then that puts Ukraine in a very difficult position on the battlefield. It could well force them to the negotiating table in a position of weakness and conclude with a peace deal that is in Russia's favour. That is an outcome that Ukraine, of course, and its Western allies are desperate to avoid, because it would be seen as rewarding Vladimir Putin, giving him something that he can spin as a victory over the West. But despite that potential for a positive outcome for Moscow, for now they're keeping their cards very close to their chest.
You're watching Sky News Today. Coming up, we're going to return live to the US and hear from a former speechwriter to George W. Bush. Well, let's return to the US election. And it seems that the economy and the rising cost of living across America may have been one of the biggest factors that influenced the way people voted. For many, they felt better off under Donald Trump's first presidency than they have done in recent years, and are keen for a return to financial hope. Our international affairs editor, Dominic Waghorn, reports from the key battleground state of Pennsylvania.
In a Philadelphia diner, they were digesting the news with their breakfast. Their state had won it for Donald Trump. For some, this has been a one-issue election.
Economy, bottom line, economy. We got to stop giving it away.
What has it been like living under Joe Biden's economy?
Oh, Jesus. It was one of the worst. One of the worst that I have experienced in my lifetime. You know?
Many hope Donald Trump will restore their fortunes.
I sold my house and moved in with my daughter because I couldn't afford my mortgage anymore. I don't have a lot of money to do the things I want with. My money has gotten very small.
And do you think Donald Trump will help with that?
If he doesn't, I might kick him in the butt.
Then we have your other little, like
like the log cabins over there.
In her gift shop over the road, Rosemary Veneziali sells nostalgia and souvenirs and hopes Donald Trump can bring back the good times, because she says he understands what Americans have been going through.
He sees it. He knows it. He's seeing the people suffer. He's seeing them not be able to buy food. He's seeing all the things that we could have, we don't have.
There was euphoria amongst Trump supporters last night when Pennsylvania swung to Donald Trump. They knew their state would prove pivotal in winning back the White House in his extraordinary comeback. It's been said that this election has been like no other, but the story we've heard from voters up and down this crucial swing state is one we've heard many times before in America. The issue that came up more than any other was the price of food and fuel. Yet again, it seems it was the economy that mattered the most. From Philadelphia to Pittsburgh, from diners to doorsteps, the same refrain. Americans do not feel as well off now as they did under Trump.
Anybody who can't see that this country fell off a cliff over the last 4 years is an idiot. And I hate to say that because I don't want to feel that way towards my countrymen, but it's just the fact.
The same sentiment right across Pennsylvania has helped shift the state decisively to Donald Trump and drive him to victory. Dominic Waghorn, Sky News, Philadelphia.